Some of the stories in this video contain subject matter that some viewers may find disturbing. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you want to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. My family moved around a lot when I was a kid. It was pretty hard on me each time, because I would always meet friends and then we would end up moving elsewhere, potentially in a new school district. One year we actually moved a state over to New Hampshire, into this small, quaint neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else. It was nice as a kid because everyone knew your name and your parents, and always gave you stuff like cookies or presents. Things like that. My parents said that they didn't care for it, because everyone was also very nosy and tried to involve themselves in everything. Everyone except one neighbor, Paul. But he told us to call him Polly. Polly was interesting, to say the least. He was very eccentric, outgoing, and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He lived in the house to the left of us. He was one of the first people we met when we moved in, as he was quick to come over and give my parents a hand in moving some of the heavier and bigger items. I was about 12 at the time, so I wasn't much help with moving, other than small stuff or my stuff, really. My parents basically had me sorting out boxes, or setting up my room if it meant not getting in the way. One of the first days that we were moving in, Polly showed up and started helping and introduced himself. He wasn't married and didn't have any kids, but he did have pets. Chickens. He had about a dozen of them, and they were probably the most pampered chickens that I'd ever seen. He built this coop that was just tall enough for me to walk in, and was like a life-sized playhouse. Each chicken had their own bed, and each was a different color. He told me they had assigned beds, but I don't know how true that actually was. Like, if he had them trained to go to specific beds or not. But anyways, there were also small doors on the side where he could collect their eggs. He always told us that he never bought store eggs because they were gross, and that his were all natural. Several of our other neighbors bought eggs from him too, including my parents. I did like to go over there to pet and feed the chickens, as we didn't have any pets, so it was the closest thing for me. I did have an older sister, but she wasn't interested in them like I was, so it was typically just me wandering off. We also saw him sleeping outside a lot. It wasn't in a tent or a hammock or anything either. He was just lying in the middle of the yard. My parents thought there was something wrong with him one time, as I remember my mom yelling, telling my dad to go check on him, and as she was on the phone with what I think was 911, my dad ran over there to see what had happened. I stared out the window with my mom as I saw him stand up just fine, smile, and talk with my dad. After explaining to the emergency people that it was a false alarm, they both came walking back, and he apologized for scaring my mom. From then on, if we saw him out on the lawn, we didn't even bother him, as that was just who Polly was. So, he definitely had some weird quirks about him, but he was also harmless. We lived there for almost a year before we started having issues. Polly was also the type where, if you gave him an inch, he would try to take a mile. My dad had a lot of tools in our shed, and sometimes Polly would come over asking my dad for help, or he would ask to borrow something, and he would let him, but then he started taking stuff without telling my dad. My dad used his tools for his job, so when something came up missing, it could cause him to be held up on a job. One day, my dad saw Polly carrying something of his, put it back in the shed, and then walk off. He was upset because he didn't even ask or tell him he was using it, and it was gone for a few days. This caused my dad to put a lock on the shed to prevent stuff from coming up missing. There was another time that we started hearing what sounded like running water, and it would happen while we were all in the living room or having dinner, so no one was running water in our family, taking a shower or anything like that. My dad was worried about a pipe bursting or something, until one night my dad went out to his shed and could hear the sound. He found our water spigot on the side of our house was on, and Polly came walking over with 2 buckets. He said his water had been shut off and he was needing water for his chickens and to take a bath. As mad as he was, I remember, based on the conversation he had with my mom, that he'd helped him fill the water for the chickens and offered to let him take a shower at our place, but again told him that he couldn't just do that, as it was wasting water, and it was using our water, of course. So, this was a normal thing for him. And my mom told us when we were older that this was something he did to a lot of the neighbors. She talked to one of them who said if you weren't hard on him, he wouldn't stop. She also said he seemed to hold it over their heads that if you bought eggs from him, you owed him something, even though everyone paid him with cash or check for those eggs. They weren't getting them for free. They also learned that his water was never shut off. Another neighbor had told them that, again, he will do that to pull the pity card. He really tried to cheapen his expenses, I guess, at the expense of others. If he wasn't going to move anytime soon, then my parents decided they were going to have to be more strict on things. And that included not buying eggs from him anymore. This, of course, annoyed him too. He kept trying, but my parents would always refuse. They had locks on the shed and garage, and my dad actually turned off the water that went to the spigots so he couldn't use those either. However, he still showed up to parties, or if we had a cookout, things like that. It was harder to make him leave at that point, because he had other neighbors over, so it was a little harder to try and make just one specific person leave. It was in April that we finally stopped seeing him around. Again, at the time, I was still pretty young, so I didn't quite understand everything that was going on with Polly, except that I could tell that my parents didn't really want him around anymore. One day, I was standing at the bus stop by myself when I saw Polly walking up to me. I didn't get any weird vibes from him, and my parents never said that I had to avoid him, so I just smiled and waved at him as he approached. He stopped next to me and made a joke about me being suspicious standing here alone. I told him I was waiting for the bus. We made some small talk, and he brought up Easter and asked what we were doing for it. I told him probably nothing, since neither me nor my sister still believed in the Easter Bunny or anything like that. He actually looked surprised and asked me why not. I remember not knowing how to respond to this because he was an adult, and it clearly wasn't real, so why would he be so surprised that a 12 to 13-year-old didn't believe in it? He then went into this whole long story about some legend of the Easter Bunny, and how you can still get candy and goodies from him even if you're an adult, as long as you believed in him. I laughed, because who the hell would believe this? But he actually looked confused, and offended that I was laughing. I apologized, but he basically said, if you don't believe it, you'll soon realize your errors. Thankfully, the bus was pulling up because I couldn't see him laughing and saying just kidding at this point, so I got on the bus saying sorry and nothing else. I went through the rest of the school day just fine, and without seeing Polly again for the rest of the week either. That Sunday was Easter, and part of me thought about what he said and what he had meant by it. I told my sister when I was in her room with her about what he said, and she basically said the same thing that I was thinking. That he was trying too hard to convince someone to believe in something that we already knew didn't exist. She then told me it would probably be best to just avoid him as much as possible, calling him weird. I still didn't really think he was weird, but I let it go and went to bed as normal. At some point in the night, I'd woken up and remembered just laying in bed, facing towards my door. I decided to roll over to maybe try another position to fall back to sleep. The opposite wall had a window that faced the side of our yard, facing towards Polly's house, and I liked to have it cracked open when it was cooler. I had a dark purple curtain, but it was still sheer, so the wind could easily catch it too. It was really peaceful, so on this night, I had it cracked open some, and I watched the curtain move as I slowly drifted back to sleep. I remembered that night, though. I had a strange dream, or what I thought was a dream. I heard weird noises coming from my window, and then I heard someone whispering my name. But when I looked out there, I couldn't see anyone. But I kept hearing someone walking around. The next morning, I woke up remembering my dream and immediately looked over at my window, where I saw a small envelope. It was sealed on the back with a small flower sticker, and when I opened it, there was a small card in there with handwriting on it. I think my parents threw it away after this, but it said something like, "Dear Amanda, I heard you don't believe in me and that made me sad. However, maybe I can prove to you that I'm real. Please check on my friends in your front yard. Sincerely, the Easter Bunny." What the hell does any of that even mean? Friends? I had no idea what this had to do with anything, but it definitely piqued my interest. So, in my pajamas, I swiftly walked out of my room into the front door. I passed by the living room where my mom was making breakfast. I'm sure she saw me, or at least heard me open the door. I walked out, and I saw a basket sitting on the front porch first. They were all colorful, like someone had painted eggs and just left them. Then, I saw something furry in the yard. And then I saw another furry lump in the yard. Curious, and also an animal person, I walked toward the closest one. To my horror, it was a dead rabbit, missing its head. I was terrified, but as I looked over to the next one, I noticed that it was dead too. I immediately started crying and ran back into my house, screaming for my mom. She met me at the door, and I tried explaining to her what had happened between the tears. She told me to go back in the house and sit in the kitchen, as she closed the door and yelled for my dad. I remember my dad walking out in the yard while my mom stood in the doorway, and it wasn't long after that my dad walked up to my mom, furious, telling her to call the cops. The rest of the day was kind of everywhere, and my parents seemed to talk forever to them while my sister tried to keep me occupied and get my mind off of what was going on. So, obviously, I didn't believe in the Easter Bunny before. This definitely didn't convince me either. How the hell was it supposed to anyways? I learned from my sister when I got a little older that it was definitely Polly that did it too. I showed them the card that I got, and they had a feeling that it was him. He also had the gall to approach my parents while they were picking up the dead rabbits, asking how we were, and asking for me specifically. My sister said our dad looked like he was about ready to kill him, but he just yelled at him and threatened him that if he ever came back onto our property, he would take care of him. From then on, we would find random eggshells in our yard, stuck to our house, shed, or car. Oh, and the basket of eggs, by the way, were also raw. They weren't fake or even hard-boiled. So, even weirder. Because of him actually damaging property, and other neighbors witnessing this, we were able to get a restraining order. The neighbors always tried to get more information on what was happening and tried to tell us about him, but my mom didn't want anything to do with it. I know she definitely did not feel comfortable being there anymore, and since it was clear he wasn't going to move anytime soon, we did. He may not necessarily have been dangerous at the time, but that man definitely had something wrong with him. And sometimes it felt like it was only a matter of time before he snapped. Thankfully, we moved with minimal issues, and he was the weirdest neighbor that we ever had. I'll start by saying that I was a pretty ornery kid growing up. I'm a middle child, and at the time, my older brother was 18, so he was hardly home at this point. I was 13, and my little sister was about 6. My parents' attention was pretty focused on her at the time, so I guess you could say it was due to the lack of attention. Middle child syndrome, who knows. I had troubles in school, as in not turning in assignments, not paying attention, just things like that. I wouldn't say I was really a troublemaker, just more so acted out some. I don't blame anyone for it, though, because my parents were fine. I was just a crappy kid. I bring this up to explain briefly how I got into the following situation. It was Easter weekend, and our neighborhood typically got together and did an Easter egg hunt for younger kids, and had a few games or activities. They had someone dressed up as the Easter Bunny a few times as well. I, of course, didn't have anything to do with it. I didn't believe in the Easter Bunny, but was always told to keep quiet, or I would get looks from my parents if I made remarks about it. My sister still believed in it, so I couldn't kill her fun. This year, though, I was allowed to have a friend stay over since they were going to be busy at the egg hunt. That way I wasn't bored and home alone. So, my friend Nick and I had stayed up late that night playing COD, so we were still asleep when my parents left for the egg hunt. When we finally woke up, we went and had leftover pizza for breakfast, played some more Call of Duty, and just screwed around in the house. As kids do, though, we started getting bored. So, we decided we would try to sneak around to where the egg hunt was to grab a few for ourselves. We may not have been interested in the whole Easter aesthetic, but we were still kids, and we didn't say no to free candy. So, we walked over towards the community center. It had a pool there and a small gym, and I noticed that one of my friends, Jacob, was standing near his parents. I remember shouting for him, and his face lit up when he saw us, like the "finally someone is here to save me" kind of look. He turned and said something to his mom. She looked over at us and motioned for him to go, so he took off towards us. He came over and said that his mom told him he could go, but he had to be back by the center in an hour or so, as they had somewhere they had to go. So, we decided to start walking around the trail, as Jacob didn't have any eggs either. He said the hunt was already over, but they were doing games and stories, so we were free to take any other eggs that we found. We got around to the other side of the trail, which was a good distance from the center. We'd only found like 4 eggs or so at this point, so we were just messing around, grabbing sticks and rocks to jab or throw at each other, finding bugs to crush or throw, climbing the trees, dumb things like that. Like I said, I was a menace, I'm sure. While on the path, we were approaching one of those pet stations that had bags to pick up after your dog, but there was someone standing there in a rabbit costume. It being Easter, we assumed that they were there for the party to take pictures with, and things like that. Jacob said that he hadn't seen anyone in a costume while he was there, but we just thought maybe they were late or maybe they were inside the community center instead. I mean, no one would just be walking around in some kind of rabbit costume otherwise, right? I didn't think anything else of it, other than if it was me, I would take it off as soon as possible, and I made a comment about it to my friends. They laughed and agreed. And that's when Nick finally decided to ask him. He shouted, "Hey, do you normally dress like that?" And we all chuckled a bit. They turned and looked at us, but they didn't say anything. Jacob decided to jump in and made some comment about laying eggs for us, squatting as he did it. And this got us both to laugh again. The guy just tilted his head to the side and was making a fist. There were a couple of other comments made by all of us, including me, but nothing physical. I know teasing and making fun of this guy was not cool now, but as a kid, I didn't really think anything of it. Hell, part of me also thought that I was a kid. What's he gonna do? Yell at us? Tell our parents? So, we just had our fun. I finally made a comment about how maybe the costume was turning him into an animal since he couldn't talk back, and Jacob made a motion to dismiss him, and we continued walking down the path, passing him. As we passed him, he turned with us, watching us as we walked by. That's when we all noticed the smell. At the time, all I could think to describe it as was like a chemical. It was strong and nauseating. Now that I'm older, and in the field that I'm in, I realize the smell was formaldehyde, which confuses me even more now as an adult. Why did he reek of formaldehyde? This kind of became off-putting for us, so we all stopped laughing and just kept walking, if not a little faster to pass him. After we were so far ahead, I looked back and saw him facing toward us, making a fist with the bunny hand. I mentioned it to my friends, and they turned back to look as well. I think Nick was trying to act tough at this point, so he said, "What are you gonna do? Not bring us candy next year?" And started laughing. Jacob and I let out a weak chuckle again, and that's when this guy started charging at us. We all took off running as fast as we could. We didn't get far when the guy quickly caught up to us and managed to grab Jacob by his hoodie, knocking him to the ground. We stopped a few feet ahead of him, waiting to see what he was going to do, but we're also frozen, not knowing what we should do. That's when, without saying a word, he got on his knees over Jacob and put his hands around his throat. He was mumbling something that I still have no idea what he was saying to this day, and Jacob was groaning, grabbing at his hands and trying to stop him. We were just kids. We did not know what to do here. I watched as Jacob's face turned colors and Nick ran up to him, jumping on this guy and hitting him in his head, and anywhere else he could swing. Nick was yelling. I was yelling for help, as I looked around trying to figure out what to do. Something must have snapped him out of it, as the guy seemed to loosen his grip, and I charged at him as Nick was still halfway on his back, which we somehow managed to knock him off balance, and he rolled to the side. We got Jacob up as quickly as we could, and as he was trying to catch his breath, we dragged him to run with us. We took off down the trail yelling for help, when we finally came across a couple of old ladies jogging. They looked annoyed, maybe confused at first, until they noticed how distraught we were, and dirty. We told them what happened, and one of them immediately pulled out their phone and called 911. And they walked with us back the way they came from, and we cut through part of the grass to get back to some of the houses where we stayed until the cops and our parents arrived. We told them what had happened. Maybe not being completely honest at first about what we were saying to the man, but they immediately started patrolling the area to find this guy. My dad had that look on his face that he knew I wasn't being completely honest, so I told him what all had happened. Again, I know that what we did wasn't okay, but we just moved on. Nothing ever got physical until this guy decided to attack us. A bunch of kids. I got a small talk about how I shouldn't have done that, but what he did was far from okay as a reaction. The worst part of all this, they never even found the guy. My mom also said they never had an Easter bunny there, and confirmed it with the staff. No one knew why there was some guy dressed in a rabbit costume walking around the trail, who he was, or where he went. I wasn't allowed to walk around alone anymore, but to be honest, I was too afraid to. Hell, I didn't even want to stay home alone, fearing this guy might know where I live and come back for me. I didn't believe in the Easter Bunny before, and from then on, I never really cared for rabbits or costumes like that. And don't worry, I learned my lesson. Don't make fun of people like that again. Adults or kids that were my age. My family isn't really huge on get-togethers or gatherings, with literally two exceptions: Thanksgiving and Easter. On Thanksgiving, we typically have all of the family come over to my grandmother's house, which includes those of us that are out of state. Easter is a bit different, though. It's usually just those that are nearby, mostly immediate family, and we typically reserve one of the party areas at our local park. Since where we live has a perfect spring pretty much every year, we've always had our Easter parties outside at the park, and it normally goes pretty well. We're always respectful to the people nearby, we clean up after ourselves, and we try our best not to be too loud. We've actually had a few times where we would just invite people that happened to be at the park over to have some food if they were interested. We always make too much, and even if you're not family, we would prefer to spread some positivity and joy to others. Most of the time, this will result in some awkward looks, and once the people realize we're being genuine, they come over and get to know us. There have been a few times where things went a bit south, and there was one specific event that actually almost ruined this tradition for us, which is what this story is about. And this happened back in 2017, which would have been April 16th of that year. I remember this because it was actually 2 days before my 20th birthday, so I was 19 at the time. We had prepared for the same Easter festivities as we'd had every year. We bought the food we needed, made sure everyone was going to be there, and we made absolutely sure that we had the park's party area reserved. I don't really know what to actually call it, but it's like a gazebo by the pond. This park is very specific about reservations with large parties using this area, and they actually require a $50 deposit for it, which basically reserves your date. We paid it, got the paper that showed we had it reserved, and we were ready to go. The day arrived, we got all of our food prepared and headed up to the park as a family. While we were a decent-sized group, we weren't necessarily a huge one. The group on this date was myself, my 3 siblings, my parents, grandparents, and then my aunt and uncle on my mom's side with their 2 kids. So, it was a grand total of 12 adults, 16 people total if you count my nieces and nephews. We all got there and got our stuff ready to take out to the gazebo when we noticed that there was a small group of around 6 or so people sitting there and eating as a group. No big deal, really. It looked like they were just eating their lunch together, which honestly meant that they would likely be going elsewhere pretty quick. We all decided to go ahead and head over to set up, and we would just inform them that we had it reserved. As we approached, I could tell that at least one of the people wasn't happy seeing a large group approaching them. For the record, the gazebo has a few tables under it, so we weren't crowding them in or pushing them out. We were just loading our stuff to the back end and setting up on the other table. After we got all of our stuff loaded into the gazebo, my uncle very politely informed the people sitting there that we had the spot reserved and asked them if they would be much longer, because we were going to get set up for the party. Most of the group seemed to be okay with what was going on, if not a little annoyed, sure, but they said they were just about to leave. However, the older man of the group was visibly unhappy with it, the same one that was rolling his eyes at us as we approached. The rest of them got up, but he just stayed there and retorted to my uncle's statement that you couldn't reserve the gazebo, it was first come, first serve. My uncle told him that that was incorrect, and pulled the copy of the reservation notice from his pocket, saying that we had paid for the spot so we could all have our get-together. He mentioned to the man that they were free to join us and have food when it was all done, but in the nicest way he could, basically told them to leave until that point. The man threw a few expletives our way and told us where to shove our food, but then got up and walked away, all while calling us names and just being a brash individual. I get that he was upset, but we had it reserved. It wasn't like we just called the police or park rangers or whatever and had them removed. My uncle was nice about it, and even invited them back when it was all done, but he'd asked them to leave so we could have some time as a family. Obviously, this isn't where this all ended, though honestly it should have been. We all kind of thought that this guy was going to just be rude and walk away from the situation, which is what pretty much happened at first. We got the tables set up. My uncle, dad, and grandpa were over at the grill making food and chatting. I was sitting with my nieces and nephews and chatting it up with them as much as they wanted me to. Everyone else was just having a good time with the family. After a little while, my sister motioned for me to look up, and when I did, I saw the rude guy and another man walking back up the trail toward the gazebo. With how it was set up, you could see anyone walking up to the party area, and there was no way that they could be going somewhere else. The trail was basically a dead end that led to where we were. I shook my head and just kind of thought, maybe he's here to apologize. Maybe he realized he was being rude. But of course, that's not how things went. As they approached, my uncle and my father looked up and asked if they could help them, basically just cutting it to the chase. The rude guy started shouting about how my uncle and our family had violated his constitutional rights by kicking him out of a public place. I'm not joking. This guy said it was unconstitutional for us to use a public park's party area that we had paid for and reserved for this day. My uncle stared at him and basically laughed at this comment. He told him that we had reserved the space, that we had paid for it, that we had signed a document that allowed us to be there, and that he hadn't even kicked him out, just asked if they would leave for a little while and possibly come back later. My uncle is a super calm and collected man, as evidenced by his response to the man's earlier aggression, but he was pretty clearly done with this crazy guy's BS. This is where things started to get a little hairy. The second man approached my uncle and started shoving him, basically saying that he was going to beat the hell out of him. All the while, my uncle was attempting to de-escalate the situation. This guy, however, was not interested in de-escalation, and he started to grab at my uncle, which caused my dad to try and intervene. And pretty quickly, it was a 4-man fight with my uncle, father, and the 2 men all scuffling over this stupidity. It hit its peak when the man that was fighting my uncle ended up getting the upper hand on him and actually slammed his face against the grill. All I could hear was my uncle screaming in pain, which caused everything and everyone else to go silent and stare at the situation. I think the guy realized that this minor fight had quickly escalated to potential permanent injury and that he was about to get into major legal trouble. Thankfully, being a public park, there were other people around, and someone had called the cops already, basically calling them by the time the argument had even started. By the time these two men attempted to get away from us, the cops were already pulling up. It was insane to me that a family get-together had turned into a quick fight, significant injury, and my uncle in an ambulance with major burns and part of his face in less than 5 minutes. Like, the entire feeling of the day shifted hard in an instant, because this guy was upset that we wanted to use the area that we had reserved. Obviously, he was arrested. They both were. And the cops took statements from the entire family. We packed up and took everything home and decided that we would just eat at my grandma's house later. None of us really wanted to eat anyways, with my uncle in the hospital. He actually did recover, for the most part, but he does have a gridiron-looking scar on the side of his eye where the grill seared into his skin. And my uncle, being my uncle, he likes to make jokes about it. He now says that he knows what it feels like to be a steak. Thankfully, this didn't dissuade us from having our Easter get-together at the park, and we actually have it reserved in a couple weeks for this upcoming Easter. So this was a collection of Easter horror stories, creepy Easter stories, scary Easter stories, stories involving Easter in some way, shape, or form, stories that occurred on Easter. As a kid, I actually quite liked Easter, because I liked candy, and I liked eggs. And I liked candied eggs, as in eggs that were candy. Candy eggs, not candied eggs. That's a totally different thing. Anyways, yeah. Hopefully you all enjoyed this collection of stories. I know I did. Good stories in this one. Very creepy. Very, very themed, as Fridays are. Sorry if I don't sound well. I think I'm getting a sinus infection. I'm starting to get that fun pain up in my nose, and my throat was feeling funky the other day, so it still is. Sinus infections hit me constantly. I get those all the freaking time. Always a good time. Always fun. Anyways. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, hit the thumbs up button. If you didn't, I'm sorry. If you're new, subscribe to the channel, please. If you like what you heard, if you didn't like what you heard, well, again, sorry. You can also leave me a comment, letting me know your thoughts. What are your thoughts on chocolate Easter rabbits? The big chocolate Easter bunnies. I like the chocolate they use for those. I think it's some of the best chocolate. That's just me. Anyways, happy Easter, everybody, if you celebrate Easter. If not, well, happy Sunday. It's Friday. Happy whatever. Just have a good day. I'll talk to y'all later. And until then, sleep well.